Comrades, you're going to have to excuse me if this is a bit rough and disjointed. It was written on trains and buses and planes, but hopefully we can get some discussion going. Of course, the second session, which I wanted to introduce, is how we get from where we are right now to where we want to be, which is a position where we have a mass communist party, democratically organised and capable of challenging the ruling class for power on that basis. That is, of course, going to be a very long journey with multiple developments and twists and turns along the way, and I won't even begin to cover all of it. I'll probably focus on what we might do in the immediate future and some of the intermediate stages. But if we just begin with thinking for a moment about the forces that we have right now who are beginning to cohere around this shared priority, this understanding that forming that kind of party is what we need. And it's been said that that's a minority within a minority, and that's right, because of course there are lots of Marxists within society, even very committed Marxists who don't yet see that formation of that new mass democratic communist party as a priority. So we have to understand that in terms of that shared understanding and the beginnings of that approach, we are still a minority, even among Marxists. It's a minority certainly within the left, and an even smaller minority proportionally within the working class and its movement. In terms of talking about socialism and the group that have been organising, talking about socialism, our activity thus far has been really organising fortnightly discussions, which thus far are taking place online on Zoom, and have made a modest step forward to engendering a culture of serious but open and friendly and comradely debate. But it's a very limited and modest step forward. This is the first in-person meeting that we've organised as TAS, as Talking About Socialism, and we have to recognise that as a small group, there is inherently a limit to what we can do, and it raises the question of who else there might be who agrees with us on fundamentals of ideas and a fundamental shared approach that we can work with. And of course, we are in touch with various people who I'll come on to in a moment. It's clearly not the case that those of us who've been all involved in organising the discussion meetings as Talking About Socialism are the only people who have the ideas which are set out in our statement of principles. Clearly there are people in this room, I would hope, who would agree broadly with that statement, even if they may take issue with this or that point in it. And there are also people who are watching online today and people who couldn't make it to this meeting. So there are people there. But if we think, the category that I'd like to focus on really is comrades who are on record as advocating, as a minimum, that new democratic mass communist party, something which is different from all the other existing organisations on the Marxist left. So clearly the group that have been involved in organising TAS. There's also the editorial board of a magazine called Prometheus, which I've been involved in, which a few other people present are involved in as well. Communist Future, which is an organisation in Manchester, which was set up in order to present a public face and intervene in the general election of earlier this year. And of course, the weekly work called CPGB group, who've advocated that kind of idea for a long time. More broadly, of course, there are others out there, and I agree with what Nick said, the sentiment that he expressed, which is that anybody who's stayed the course and remained true to their principles and who hasn't sold out, who hasn't departed from the communist movement, despite the many setbacks and the defeats that we've endured, is to be congratulated. And more importantly, they are part of the solution to the problems that we face. They're not part of the problem, they're part of the solution. And so we need to think carefully about how we address people who fit into that very broad category. There are many thousands of them, certainly in this country. So if we think about the long road ahead, the long journey ahead, because clearly the journey from where we are right now, this position of real weakness and isolation, towards that mass communist party of millions, tens of millions in the UK and other comparable countries all around the world capable of challenging power. If we think about that journey, then the process taking us there is something that's going to need careful consideration. Having said that, of course, when you set out on a long journey, you can't, and it doesn't make sense to try and anticipate every step that you're going to take along the way, because things will change, the weather will change, you'll meet people along the way, you don't know the precise terrain that you're going to encounter. All of those plans could be for nothing if you are too precise in trying to anticipate exactly what's going to happen at each precise step. But equally, you can't plan a successful journey through unfamiliar and challenging territory unless you have a broad, vague idea about the milestones that you would like to reach along the way, perhaps an idea of when you'd like to reach them, how you're going to measure your progress, what you would like to do along the way, and how you are going to overcome some of the challenges that you might reasonably anticipate in getting there. You also have to go in with a certain amount of caution and preparedness, because if you're setting out on a long hike, let's say, then you set out charging off on the first morning, you tie yourself out on the first morning of the hike, you don't ration your water supply, but you're going to very quickly run into difficulties. And it follows then, doesn't it, that it makes sense to have a vague idea of the route ahead, your itinerary, milestones, and to adopt that analogy, then we, in this long project that we have ahead of us, can and should do the same. Although we are, as I've said, not to put too fine a point on it, in a very difficult period, one in which we as communists are very far back, very isolated politically, we're not completely without resources. We have the people that we're able to find, people we've known perhaps for some length of time, but also new people who we encounter through our activity in the movement. And the people who are in attendance today demonstrates that there are people coming together around these shared ideas. And so we have a nucleus of people who are prepared to work together, I hope, on this kind of project. So where are we? We're at a point where we have a very few comrades in the grand scheme of things, a very modest number, but an encouraging number, who, despite coming at this idea from different backgrounds, with different experiences, different types of political training, have all come towards the idea of a new mass communist party and reached some very clear and important conclusions about what is required, what our most urgent tasks are for the next period. And that's the crucial starting point, isn't it? What is required? Because we always base ourselves on what is required, not simply what can we do, how do we keep busy, but what objectively is required to arm our class for a strategic objective, which is to take power. What objectively is needed for that? Well, again, we arrive at the idea of a mass communist party, not simply whatever stopgap measure or whatever formation that we think might keep us busy for a few years. So I want to sketch out, if I can, some thoughts about key milestones that we might anticipate in the project. And the most significant, of course, is the end destination, which I've spoken about already. What other milestones do we think we might encounter and anticipate along the way? Given the modest but present and active forces which I've mentioned earlier, of various organisations and trends and pockets of individuals who are advocating broadly similar ideas about the problems facing our movement and the solution to them, then we can, I think, reasonably expect that with a serious approach to regroupment of communists who are committed to the idea of a new mass communist party, that in the not too distant future, we could achieve an organisation perhaps of a few dozen or several dozen. There is the basis for that in the UK. Now, clearly that's, in terms of what's required, in terms of the tens of millions aspiration, it's incredibly modest, but it is quite clearly one of the very first steps that we will have to take. What would an organisation of that kind do? What tasks would it set itself? What could it realistically expect to do? I think it would probably operate mostly on the terrain of ideas and propaganda, because an organisation of a few dozen isn't, for instance, going to be able to mount serious nationwide interventions into the working class movement as a whole, trade unions of 1 million plus members. It would be over-egging the pudding, to say the least. So it would operate mostly on the ideas and the propaganda, reaching out to other isolated pockets, individuals, small groups who are either there and have reached the ideas already, the same ideas, or are very close and can be won over without too much effort. I think with some serious effort and commitment, that organisation, that stage, if you like, that staging post along the route to a mass communist party of, let's say, a few dozen members, that could exist next year. I don't see any reason why that couldn't exist next year. Ideally, it would have some benefits for us, which principally address the fact that we are isolated, and it's very, very difficult to operate in circumstances like this. It would ideally involve some rationalisation of our efforts, some avoidance of duplication. If you consider that there are perhaps 3 publications all advocating broadly similar ideas, although we shouldn't necessarily overestimate or assume too much about the level of political agreement for discussions, but let's say the ideas are broadly similar and compatible with each other, and those comrades all belong in the same organisation ultimately. And clearly, one publication has the potential to be significantly more effective than the 3 publications doing the same thing. But if that isn't possible for whatever reason, it's difficult to anticipate, then 3 publications who are in active communication and collaboration with each other and at least working towards a shared set of priorities is better than no collaboration at all. And so there is, in other words, a lot that can be achieved by communication between individuals and groups who are ultimately advocating very similar ideas. How can that next step, that very, very interim step, be achieved? Well, I think I'm not giving much away to the people present in this room, and hopefully those watching online as well, where when I say that comrades in various organisations that I've mentioned have been having very early stage bilateral talks between each other. So representatives of Talking About Socialism have met with a representative of the Prometheus editorial board. The same thing is happening with contact between Prometheus and comrades who are involved in the weekly worker group through the guise of the Y Marx project. And that, in my view, is entirely positive. You can't presume to know the outcome or exactly how long things will take, but it's positive. I think, being realistic, if we want talks like that to bear fruit, then a series of bilateral talks, all involving various permutations of the same groups, inevitably raises the question of when everybody is going to get in the same room. And there are going to be multilateral talks about how we can progress the fight for a new mass communist party in which we all belong to a common organisation. In the first instance, I think those kinds of discussions would have to establish or try to establish the level of political agreement which actually exists between comrades. And it might be a reasonable supposition that the level of agreement which does exist is quite high, because of course, being a minority within a minority within a minority, you might expect that we agree on a lot. and have arrived at these conclusions through a negative assessment in broad terms of the alternative out there. There is a reason that we are, for instance, present in this room and not at our branch meeting of the RCP or any other organisation. There's a reason that we're here talking to each other, trying to establish what we agree on, rather than there in one of the existing groups, which we've ventilated some of the problems with those already. What would the tasks of that organisation be? That what I see as the next stage, going from where we are right now, which is very, very small groups, to something which represents a very limited amount of regroupment among comrades who have the highest level of agreement, to create that perhaps a few dozen strong organisation. What would the tasks be at that point? I think principally to publish and promulgate the ideas that we are uniting around. And this does a few things. It serves, first of all, to reach others to whom the ideas are already appealing and who are simply waiting to be drawn that little bit further in and convinced of certain conclusions about the left and the movement and what exactly we need to advocate. There will also be people out there who are new to the ideas, and inevitably we will reach some of those as well, although that is a lot more difficult when you're in a small organisation, because it's difficult to target who you're reaching, and it's difficult without the kind of sustained intervention in the labour movement and in other movements as well. It's difficult to bring new people in, but nonetheless there will be some, and we should try and bring them in. And finally, publishing and putting forward our ideas and putting them out there also forces us to clarify our own ideas and to refine them and to establish really if we're getting it right and putting ourselves on a firm footing, and to think carefully about the way that we're putting those ideas forward. Other tasks for that organisation, providing a pole of attraction for people who would otherwise perhaps be recruited by one of the various undemocratic sects out there, because of course that is a key problem with our movement. People are recruited into these organisations often quite an early stage of their political education. They're then really miseducated, to put it bluntly, about various means of organising, and that is a very difficult problem to overcome. And so providing an alternative pole of attraction is important. And then finally, to the very limited extent possible, I think an organisation, even at a very early stage with very small numbers, should consider taking on whatever public facing functions that we would expect the future mass communist party to take on. And so I have in mind, for instance, things like standing in election campaigns, the sorts of big tasks that you would expect that it would be absurd if a party of tens of millions didn't do. We should constantly keep under review whether there are any tactics of that kind, which despite our small numbers, it makes sense to pursue because of the advantages that it may bring in terms of recruitment, and which can be done in a way which doesn't leave people demoralised. And although there were quite considerable difficulties in doing it, that was part of the motivation behind Communist Future's intervention into the election campaign. Despite very small numbers, it was thought that it would be a positive step forward to organise in a way which was in advance of where we were at that present moment. There's nothing wrong with being ambitious in my view, although of course you need to be very aware of the significant risks involved. Thinking ahead a bit beyond that milestone that I've identified, perhaps the next milestone that's worth thinking about after that, although we are clearly some way off from this, it is an organisation of, let's say, a few hundred members. And it's worth thinking about that, even though we are clearly far from it in this room today. It's worth thinking about it because the step after the next step informs what you do in the here and now, because you don't want to do things that are going to sidetrack you from that goal. You don't want to get stuck on a particular step, and so you have to think 2 steps ahead to the extent that it's possible. That kind of organisation, I think, would be capable of recruiting in its own right, rather than simply regrouping existing comrades who already have a high level of understanding and a high level of agreement. It would have a sustainable and durable democratic organisation. It would be capable of accommodating a variety of perspectives and positions on various issues, and it would do that via open debate and accommodation of different trends. And it would also perhaps be at the point of acquiring sufficient weight to intervene in a serious and substantial way in the movement and in the rest of the left. So those are what I see as really the next 2 significant milestones. What do we need to take with us in order to prepare for that journey? Well, I think the first is correct politics. And it might be very difficult to define. Obviously, everybody thinks that they have the correct politics. But really what it means is underlying that a serious approach to debate and a serious approach to working out your ideas, because that's how you arrive at a good fundamental politics. It doesn't mean fetishization of this or that particular narrow principle on this or that issue, but it means firmness when it comes to the fundamentals. We are setting out to build a communist party. We're not setting out to build something other than that or less than that. That's what we are setting out to build, and that's what all our efforts have to be directed towards. Second thing is openness. An organisation of any more than a few dozen will have to obviously include people who are not necessarily personal friends of yours or mine. And that's entirely positive, but it brings with it new challenges. We have to be prepared to work with people who we don't get on with. Perhaps we actively dislike them on a personal level. That will certainly be the case if we have an organisation capable of organising the majority in society and leading into power. We have to be prepared for that, and we have to approach it with the seriousness that requires at this stage. Experience and common sense, and being prepared to deploy them where necessary. If we encounter a situation where we know that because of our own experience or because of the history that we've learned that a particular course is going to lead us down one valley, then we need to be prepared to say so, and we need to be prepared to argue that openly. And finally, one of the most important, really, democracy, a commitment to democracy and guarding against bureaucratization. Because even an organisation which is on paper committed to some of the best ideas imaginable about the emancipation of all humanity, it is going to founder on the rocks, and many of them have foundered on the rocks if they are not organised democratically. We want the working class to seize control and act as what they are, what we are, the majority in society, with the right and obligation to rule. And that is not going to happen. That is completely incompatible with an approach to organising which doesn't include democracy. I'm going to talk briefly about some obstacles that we might encounter along the way from here to there. First and most obvious, when you're dealing with small numbers and trying to build something out of it, thank you, will be 5 minutes time. When you're trying to build something out of very small numbers, it's hard work. It is grinding, it can be demoralising, and that is the experience of everybody, no matter how good their organisation or how good the particular comrade concerned. And of course, not only at that early stage of small numbers, it's reasonable to assume that the revolution is going to be hard work from start to conclusion, but particularly at this early stage. So how do we mitigate against that? Well, there are various practical things we can do. We insist on the sharing of responsibilities. We avoid too much falling on certain shoulders and burning people out. We have to ruthlessly prioritise as well, in my view. We have to be very ruthless in saying that there are certain things that a small organisation can achieve, and certain things that it can't, and those that it can't will have to be put to one side for the moment. And there's nothing wrong at all, in my view, with saying that. And we have to make it an urgent priority to bring in and recruit new members who can help build the organisation up to a point of greater sustainability and viability. And that's something that's very difficult to do. It's a very difficult proposition in many people's minds to recruit somebody into what is a small organisation, even compared to the existing far left Marxist organisations, which are themselves quite small compared to the working class movement as a whole. We're even smaller than that. It can feel like a hard sell, but we need to get better at it. Other obstacles we might encounter a mistrust or a misunderstanding of what it is that we're trying to achieve. I think the most obvious of these is that people will think we are trying to build a new sect. We need to first of all think very carefully about why that's not the case. In real terms, in practical terms, what we are doing differently that makes what we are trying to build not a sect. And then, of course, how we convey that in a way, make that argument in a way that makes sense. Disagreements, there are going to be plenty of those disagreements, fallouts, which will arise out of the unfamiliarity of being in a new organisation, comrades working together who haven't previously. I think the main way to guard against this is by making time to discuss politics and dealing with disagreements rather than avoiding them. Now, it's really hard to underestimate. We shouldn't underestimate the importance of this. And then one of the principal reasons really is a practical one, which is that when you are trying to sustain a public-facing organisation of some kind, let's say a magazine, let's say a small organisation, let's say a discussion forum, you're doing it with limited numbers of people organising. Of course, it's a lot of effort. All of us work. We all have jobs, we all have other commitments, we have personal lives that we'd like to make some time for occasionally if we can. And what happens, of course, is that the time that you devote to keeping that project going all too often ends up being devoted to the business meeting, what's the next meeting on, have we got a speaker, have we booked a room, have we taken the minutes of the meeting, and so on and so on. What gets lost, what falls by the wayside all too easily, it is a real commitment to rigorously and regularly discussing the politics of what's going on and what the organisation is doing. And that can lead you, I'm sure it's clear, into real difficulties if you're not careful. One challenge which is perhaps somewhat uncertain at the moment is that we can anticipate there will be a launch of some new reformist or broad left formation or party in this country. That is going to pose a serious challenge for us as a very small group of people advocating a completely different sort of party, because many of the people who we would hope to win over to our politics and hope to draw into our project quite broadly defined, may at this point in time be attracted to the idea of a broad left party of some kind. And so we need to clearly understand and conceptualize not only why it is that we are not arguing for some other kind of party, be it broad left, be it reformist, or whatever, but also what our attitude to it will be if and when it does emerge, because of course we have no control over it. It may emerge despite what we would want to see. It may happen anyway. So we have to think about some key questions, don't we? We have to say, well, do we agree or disagree that if it does emerge, if there is a new left party formed with or without Corbyn at its head, do we think that that would be a partial step forwards in terms of achieving our goals and the working class movement getting to where it needs to be? Would it be a partial step forwards or not? Might be a question for the discussion. Or would it be perhaps a diversion, a detour, or could it even be a step backwards in certain senses? And then, perhaps regardless of your answers to those questions, what's your orientation towards a formation like that if it does come into existence? And of course, the same question applies to the Labour Party, which isn't going anywhere for the moment either. And finally, a key obstacle, a key difficulty that we can anticipate in this slow, tentative process of recruitment that I think is on the way is how we're going to deal with certain disagreements which may emerge, some of which may appear to be of quite a fundamental nature. For instance, on the question of war and imperialism, there are going to be serious disagreements on that subject based on what we see various trends on the left saying at this point in time. And so we need to be precise in our arguments. We need to address what people are actually saying rather than what we presume that they mean. And we need to really think about where our red lines are and why are they red lines, rather than taking things for granted. So I'm going to just wrap up with some very, very vague ideas about taking some first steps along the route that I've sketched out. I think that all of the communists in the various organisations that I've identified, need to make sure and put real effort into whatever form our activity takes in the next period and however closely we work together. We need to focus on making sure that our arguments and our proselytizing of communist ideas are up to date, are relevant, are attractively presented, and are confidently presented. I think we need that in order to give those ideas the best chance of success in what is going to be quite a difficult environment and a difficult situation. I think part of what we need to do has to involve calling on the existing left who, if we're serious when we say that, or I should say, that they are part of the solution, can be part of the solution rather than part of the problem, then part of what we do has to involve reaching out to them, calling on them, both members and leaders, to discuss the key question which we say is facing us and the rest of the left, the need for a new mass communist party. And calling on them to discuss it with us. And if they are willing to discuss with us, then so much the better. And if they won't discuss or they disagree with us, then let them do so as part of an open and productive discussion. And finally, the thing that perhaps we have the most control over is we should aim to convene talks of all the various groups and trends which are settled on that and in agreement, it appears, on that question of the new mass communist party, a democratic communist party, to convene talks, all of those, and to put those talks in the not too distant future on a serious practical footing with a commitment to shared work and potential unity once that can be worked out, the specifics of it, and shared work, common work, based on the maximum principled agreement possible. That's it. Thanks.